To public comment for issues that are not on tonight's agenda. Do we have any public comment this evening? Thank you. Moving on to Commission for Citizen Involvement General Updates. Does any members of the commission have any news or updates or anything? Seeing none, we'll move on to the minutes from July 24th, 2023. They're before you. May I have a motion or discussion?
I move to approve.
Motion's been made to approve. Is there a second?
I'll second the motion.
Motion is made and second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries 5-0. And moving on to our work session on vertical housing development zone pilot program update. Case number PP 23-0006. Public comment is accepted. And we have Mr. Olson. Are you presenting?
Yes, I will be presenting tonight, Chair Stewart. Thanks. All right, well, good evening, commissioners. Only this one item on the agenda today, really, at least in terms of what we'll be presenting to you tonight. It's technically an update, not a work session, so just a quick clarification. So we're going to be talking a little bit about some existing work that's happening at City Council and just generally throughout the city to explore a new tool to produce housing in key areas of the city, and that's called the Vertical Housing Development Zone. So in essence, this is a tax abatement program designed to encourage private sector housing constructed in targeted areas of the city. So I'll talk a little bit more about that moving on further, but that's generally what I'm here to talk about today. So just a brief overview of what we'll cover this evening. I'll start with a brief explanation of vertical housing tax exemptions and vertical housing development zones as a concept. I'll then go over how vertical housing overlaps with state requirements under House Bill 2003 to develop a housing production strategy here in the city. I'll then discuss City Council's recent plans to consider a vertical housing pilot program for the city-owned North Anchor site. And finally, I'll end by asking the Commission a few questions regarding how staff can learn from this pilot program as we consider the program potentially moving forward, adopting it more broadly. So there are 19 slides in my deck tonight, including this one and the first one. So a little bit shorter than the last presentation, but there will always be time for additional questions at the end of the presentation as well. Looks like there's 2 number 3s tonight for some reason. Apologies. All right, so starting with vertical housing tax exemptions. I'll start with the purpose of these exemptions. It's really, generally speaking, these exemptions are used by cities, as I mentioned before, as a tool to produce multifamily housing in planned areas of their city. So those planned areas are often the areas that the city has previously identified as being more suitable for higher density mixed-use residential with commercial ground floor development. So in Lake Oswego, you might think of areas such as our town centers like the Lake Grove Village Center and downtown, potentially some other neighborhood centers might be sort of the more appropriate areas within our city at least. So this tax abatement tool, though, is really intended to encourage the private sector to build the types of mixed-use developments that are already allowed in those areas of the city and really to encourage more of that type of construction. It also helps to produce subsidized affordable housing units within those developments. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And beyond housing, I just want to point out that there are other benefits of these vertical housing tax exemptions. It will result in an increase in property value for properties that are within these areas, and it will also increase the number of jobs, people, and businesses located in those areas. So really one of the key sort of reasons for looking at this as a tool is also related to job creation, ensuring that with residential units being provided within the city, that there are accompanying ground floor commercial uses, active places for people to go shop and sort of enjoy the amenities, as well as for jobs to be created on site there. So on the slide, you can see at the bottom, there's 2 different developments that were constructed with the help of vertical housing tax abatement. And these are both within the Tigard Triangle area. So neighborhoods, or a neighboring city that's been looking at this for quite a while. They've had a vertical housing development zone for a few years there in the city now, and they have seen these developments resulting in a total of 238 units within the areas where they're hoping to target, and again, with ground floor commercial in each of these properties. So, of course, new businesses and jobs are associated with those ground floor uses, and, they really activated this important location of the city of Tigard where they're hoping to see more residences and sort of walkable pedestrian amenities. So when we spoke with staff at the city of Tigard, they had pretty good feedback on the program. Just a bit of a side note here. They pointed out that it's kind of one of many tools. It's not, a silver bullet in and of itself, but it is one of many tools that led to the development of these particular properties, and that have been helpful in sort of generating housing in these new, relatively untested areas of the city, really sort of looking at the market for this type of development in areas outside of the sort of Portland downtown, sort of Portland proper area, some of the major corridors where there might be a natural sort of existing market for this, looking at ways to sort of stoke the market a bit in key areas in the more suburban areas. So just a little bit about how these exemptions work. They provide a partial tax exemption on building improvement value for mixed-use developments, and they're looking specifically for mixed-use developments that include non-residential use on the ground floor with housing units above. They actually outline within the Oregon Revised Statute how they define ground floor non-residential use. So basically they say, they consider ground floor to be non-residential if at least 50% of the project's ground floor that fronts on a primary public street is dedicated to that non-residential use. So they look at that 50% threshold generally, and there is a bit more nuance there, but that's the sort of, I think that's probably the most important thing for you to learn. They also require that basically the ground floor commercial spaces be constructed to building code standards for commercial use and be ready to have a commercial use occupy the space upon completion. So you can see kind of what that looks like here in Lake Oswego. Of course, this is not something that we've utilized the vertical housing program for. This is something that the city had seen developed, with the help of sort of other sort of tools that we use within the Downtown Redevelopment Design District. But for the most part, this was not constructed with a vertical housing tax exemption, but you can see kind of that it would produce a similar outcome. It's really the type of housing with ground floor commercial use that this zone is intended to produce. So kind of a model example of what we could be looking for with this type of program. I think just in general, the goal here is to provide opportunities for residents to live in sort of more amenity-rich areas of the city with shopping, restaurants, and other commercial services located within a relatively close walking distance. So just a sort of broader scale look at this, I just wanted to point out where this program is being used in Oregon currently. It's been around for some time. It's been available through the state for 5-10 years now. It's been established and sort of gone through different permutations. But there are a number of cities in Oregon that have mapped this. A lot of them are within the Portland metro area. So you can see Wood Village, Gresham, Milwaukee, Oregon City, Beaverton, Hillsborough, Forest Grove, Tigard, and Wilsonville, as well as Estacada, which is relatively close by. So you can see all those cities have really taken a look at this and decided that it's something that they think is appropriate for their context and the type of housing they're looking to promote. Thought it was interesting that it's also mapped in Central Point, LeGrand, Springfield, Cottage Grove, Roseburg, Grants Pass, Ashland. So really a variety of different areas, but you can see that there are a few different cities that are smaller than Lake Oswego, some that are larger, but a lot of them have a relatively similar context and size, particularly if you look at Tigard, Oregon City, et cetera. All right, so now moving on to vertical housing development zones. So Essentially, the vertical housing development zones are areas where vertical housing tax exemptions are available to the properties that are located within that zone. So I'll try to keep this as simple as possible, but I might call them VHDZs at some point. I'm not sure what's easier to say or hear. But these vertical housing development zones essentially just defines the area where the tax abatement can be provided. So those zones can apply to an individual site or to a small number of properties, and they could also apply to a larger scale sort of swath of a downtown. So as you can see on the slide, there is a vertical housing development zone mapped in pretty significant chunk of the central part of Estacada. So you can see that they took a little bit more widespread broad brush approach there. But there are areas of, for instance, Beaverton and some other areas of the region where they've mapped it on individual sites as well. It's important to note that for market rate construction at least, the tax abatement would only apply to the value of the building itself. So it would not apply for market rate development. You would not be able to get a tax exemption on the value of the land, but just the value of the building. However, when it comes to affordable housing, if projects were to be constructed with affordable housing that meets the requirements of the program, which are essentially affordable housing available to folks earning 80% of area median income generally. So that's kind of the overall target that they're looking for with this program. If you meet the sort of requirements for affordable housing, then you can also get exemption based on the value of the land. So generally speaking, it just applies to the building value, but with affordable housing, you can also get the land value exempted. All right, so the partial tax abatement period lasts for about 10 years, or specifically 10 years, and then after that 10 years, the full value of the project is placed on the tax rolls. So it does go back, in its sort of full, whatever the value is after 10 years, it goes right onto the tax rolls. Generally speaking, you can get a larger tax exemption with more residential floors above the ground floor. So of course, again, the requirement is that the ground floor be non-residential use. And generally speaking, you get 20% for each eligible residential floor above that ground floor. So really kind of adding those up to 80% maximum. So we're really looking at 4 stories, or I guess 4 stories of residential plus you'd be eligible for that maximum 80% exemption amount. But if you're only going to do a 2-story building with 1 story of residential, you'd only receive 20% exemption, et cetera, only 20% per residential floor. So I wanted to point out also that the taxing, so the exemption would apply to all taxing districts or jurisdictions that do not opt out when the zone is established. So those taxing districts, when we talk about those, we're talking about school districts, something like a soil conservation district, a vector control district, the Port of Portland, library districts, that kind of thing. So it would potentially apply to all of those, although the city is required as a part of the potential process to map vertical housing development zone to conduct outreach to those taxing districts. So we would learn, if they had any concerns when we conducted that outreach, and there would be the option for those taxing districts to opt out of the program. So if they did say, hey, we can't lose this revenue, this is important to us, they would have the option of opting out of the program. So that's kind of one of the main pieces as it concerns process when it comes to this program. So essentially, we would have to provide a 60-day notice to the taxing districts, and then they would have 30 days from that time to opt out of the program. So we haven't really seen too much of taxing districts choosing to opt out, and at least in terms of our initial research, but we do know of at least one example of that happening. So to put that into a bit of context. Right, so one more thing that I wanted to mention is that cities are allowed to add what they call local criteria to their vertical housing development zone programs, as long as those criteria don't conflict with the minimum state eligibility requirements. A lot of times those criteria can look like requiring design standards for the non-residential ground floor. You can see we actually already have a lot of design standards for ground floors in the downtown and Lake Grove design overlays in our city, the zoning overlays. So you can see kind of that we've already encouraged that type of outcome within the windward development. You can see kind of that connection to the street that is that you can get with these types of developments that are that are really designed to activate the pedestrian environment. So again, we have these fairly robust standards in the downtown and Lake Grove Village Center areas currently. We can always talk about which local criteria might be appropriate to Lake Oswego once we get to an appropriate point in this project, but just kind of pointing out that we can apply additional criteria beyond what I've mentioned. But a lot of the things that are covered through these additional requirements we already are accounting for in some way in our code right now. Things that we don't require necessarily right now that we could include in the local criteria are things like green building certification. That's just one idea that other cities have done, as well as requiring or actually providing more of an incentive program to reach more affordable levels of subsidized units. So again, we can talk a little bit more about whether we want to include additional local criteria for Lake Oswego if and when we receive direction to move forward with this as a strategy through our housing production work. So now I guess I'll talk about that. I'll talk about how this relates to the housing production strategy requirements of House Bill 2003. So we haven't really begun to transition into this work quite yet. Of course, we're still thinking about our housing needs analysis. Our next meeting will be a hearing on our updates to the housing needs analysis. But that's sort of one of the steps to comply with House Bill 2003. The subsequent step that we're going to be focusing a lot for the next year and a half or so is to adopt a housing production strategy. And again, we haven't really talked too much in depth about this, but I will provide a bit of a quick summary. We'll have to adopt that generally within 1 year of adopting the updated housing needs analysis, so generally by December 31st of next year. The HPS, or housing production strategy, needs to identify a set of actions to facilitate housing development that meets the needs of the community as identified in the HNA. And so generally speaking, the HPS will list specific actions to promote the development of all identified housing needs, and the different sort of strategies could be in a variety of different categories that you can see on the screen here. So that includes zoning changes, financial incentives, reduction of regulatory impediments, financial incentives. I think I already said that. But one of the sort of major categories here is tax exemption and abatement. So that is sort of one of the major categories. And if we look into a little bit more depth, sort of list that was developed by DLCD of some suggested strategies for the cities that are doing this work to analyze. You can see at number E3, strategy E3 is specifically to analyze a vertical housing development zone tax abatement as part of our housing production strategy work. So you can see that there's also some more information on this particular list about kind of what target levels for affordability this is best for. So a little bit of information there. It can be helpful for workforce to market rate level housing units that are rental. That's kind of one of the things that they pointed out here. But for the most part, we are going to have an opportunity to do a lot more of an analysis of this particular strategy once we get further along in the project. But this is one that we have a special opportunity to think a little bit more about and talk a little bit more in depth about at this point. So that's kind of why we're here with the Planning Commission. All right, so now I'll provide a brief update on a project here where the city is already exploring the use of vertical housing tax exemptions at the North Anchor site. I'd first, just before I get into detail here, though, point out that really when we talk about establishing a vertical housing development zone for this pilot program at the North Anchor site, that will be a city council decision, so that's not something that we're going to be coming to the Planning Commission necessarily for a recommendation on. What we're hoping to do today is really update the commission, you all, on this recent sort of redevelopment agency and council activity, when it comes to vertical housing, particularly considering that there is a connection between this program and our potential sort of expansion of this through the housing production strategy work. So that's kind of the main reason that we wanted to come to you today. There's a Lake Oswego Redevelopment Agency, or a LORA, board agenda item on September 19th, where they will be providing us with a little bit more direction on where to take this program. But we're looking for the commission to provide input on specifically what staff can learn from this pilot program that could inform our discussion about potentially adopting a broader vertical housing program as part of the HPS work. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, for many years the city has been working to develop some city-owned property located at the intersection of 1st Street and B Avenue. This is known as the North Anchor site. So you can see the sort of location here on the map on the screen. It's roughly between 1st and State on B Avenue, and also another parcel on the northwest corner of the intersection of 1st and B there. So it's really 3 different parcels, A, B, and C. You can see those in blue on that map. The idea really is for the development to be another mixed-use anchor to serve as a complement to the windward development further down 1st Street. So back in 2021, the Development Review Commission approved the development that was proposed at that time for these properties, which was included a boutique hotel with 83 rooms, as well as a mixed-use residential and commercial building with 67 dwelling units total, including 8 that would be affordable to those earning 80% of area median income, as well as about 6,000 square feet of commercial space. So that's kind of what was approved back in 2021. Can talk a little bit about some updates to share with you all that has happened since that time. So essentially, after it was approved by the Development Review Commission, a sort of disposition and development agreement, or DDA, was signed between the city's urban renewal agency, or that LORA board, and the developer Urban Development and Partners. And so that was an agreement that was signed back in 2021 originally, and part of that really, requires UDP, if you allow me to use that acronym for Urban Development Partners, UDP, the developer, to accomplish certain tasks prior to the city's redevelopment agency transferring the property to the developer. So it was originally expected to close by the end of last year in terms of the financing and putting this all together. And then it was extended a few times, first to June 30th of this year, and then to the end of this year to December 31st of this year, due to relatively unprecedented economic challenges. So UDP had difficulty securing progress, or making progress in securing financing, and they're having a lot of difficulty primarily due to COVID-19 related supply chain disruptions. So that led to increases in construction costs and interest rates, as well as increased inflation. So that had a pretty big impact on this project and made it difficult to sort of make the financials all sort of work out when it comes to what was approved back in 2021. So they're thinking about ways to potentially modify the project and still kind of keep it on track. So basically, I just wanted to also point out that there is a current city council goal to support business investment and job creation here in the city, and they also have an initiative specifically to keep this development on track, or the redevelopment on track. So when they decided to grant an extension for this project, sort of city council acting as the Lake Oswego redevelopment agency, decided to explore options that would immediately move the project forward without necessarily compromising its overall quality, or really requiring anything that would make them wait for more favorable economic market conditions. So they didn't want to have to wait around for the market to improve so that this project would be feasible again. They wanted to move forward quickly. So at that point, they identified that the use of a vertical housing tax exemption for the project could be one option that could help achieve that specific outcome. And so at that point, again, LORA, or council acting as LORA, directed staff to develop a pilot program, or at least to explore at this point a pilot program, to map a vertical housing development zone at the North Anchor site specific to that project. So that's really something that we were directed to look at as a pilot program of the vertical housing development zone strategy. So doing this for North Anchor would allow the project to sort of utilize that tax exemption as a gap funding measure, and would enable more timely construction of this project. It would also provide staff with some experience with which to assess this vertical housing program, and be kind of an opportunity for us to identify issues with the program components or how they're being implemented before we go on to look at expanding this program and making more sort of significant level of geography, vertical housing development zones, so applying this in a more broad way. So really, we're looking at this again as an opportunity to take stock of the pilot program and make improvements moving forward. So here's timeline for the program. You know, again, the Planning Commission is not really making a recommendation on this here, so this is an update. So you can see that's where we are in the process. Really, at this point, we're still conducting that outreach to taxing districts, and we'll be working behind the scenes on some program processes and checklists, but the next time we'll be discussing this will be with City Council on the 19th of September, and we're looking at a council hearing on the 19th of December. So we would provide all the, of course, requisite notice to the taxing districts prior to then. So that just, you know, for your knowledge, that would be the pilot program timeline. This isn't necessarily the timeline that we would look at for the housing production strategy work or incorporated into that effort. All right, so I think that covers the bulk of the content, but I really wanted to close out with opportunities for questions, of course, but also to prompt you all with some questions about what we should keep in mind with the pilot project moving forward to the housing production strategy. Before I hand it over to you all, I guess I'll just go over the questions that I was looking for some input from you all on. Is there anything that we should keep in mind as this vertical housing pilot program is developed? Is there anything related to this program that can help inform our future work, either related to compliance with state housing, generally statewide planning goals related to housing, or House Bill 2003? And also, how can we use this to sort of inform our housing production strategy discussion specifically, given that there are a number of strategies that we can kind of dig into. So we do have at least an opportunity to learn a little bit more about this one. So, what specifically can we be looking for as we move forward with this? So with that, I will hand it over to you all for questions and input.
Thank you, Eric. Well, what does everyone think?
Well, I know we're not involved in decision making on this as it relates to the North Anchor project, but I think I found it kind of disappointing to see that this strategy was proposed by the developer. To me, it looks like sort of propping up an economically infeasible project, really. I mean, interest rates are just beginning to approach historical norms. I don't think we're looking at a situation here where, they haven't been given what would on the ground be a good deal, considering that, they're getting the property for under $5 million and the city's tossing in $2 million on top of that for these large parcels. But I know we're not talking about that. I just, I don't think that we should explore this more broadly. And as it relates to housing production, as we've seen from the required analysis from the state, our needed housing production is minimal, according to their analysis. So I don't know that we need to really look at novel strategies.
If I may, I would like to disagree with that statement that the state's assessing for housing is something that's up for debate on how accurate that is. Governor Kotek has declared a state of emergency and has lofty goals for housing production. Developers are looking for jurisdictions that they can partner with when they are looking to create more housing options. And this is a way that Lake Oswego, which is historically a difficult jurisdiction to work with, can support that.
I'd just like to note that I'm not disagreeing with the state's analysis. The required analysis for making the housing needs analysis, the required numbers are the ones I'm referring to.
Eric, I've got some questions for you too. Now, again, I'm new to this, so hopefully you can just bear with me through all this. So you're asking for, what can be learned. Do we have a list of really tangible, measurable goals of what we're trying to achieve put together yet for this? So we can look at this and say, of the 10 things we wanted to achieve, we achieved all of them or half of them, but somehow measurable. Does any of that exist yet?
Specifically to the housing work, I think we're looking at metrics of housing production, the number of units and the number of units that are affordable at different income levels. I think there are a number of ways that you could, look at this as well, looking at the amount of commercial space, looking at, various different qualities of the projects that are approved, but really what this project or what a vertical housing development zone is designed to produce are, specifically the sort of cohabitation of residential units and cohabitation is not the right word, but to have residential and commercial, residential and non-residential in the same building. So in and of itself, the program is kind of designed to get that outcome. I think maybe the question for you all is that outcome something that we want to look for more of in the city? Are there ways that we can bolster this and get more housing, or is this perhaps, the tax abatement sort of nature of this, is that something that, you don't recommend for some other reason? So, I think those are the questions that I'm getting at. I think we do have pretty tangible ways to monitor the success of this type of project, and that we can look at the number of units that are created within the particular either pilot program or the larger development zone, if that is where we end up going.
Okay, good. That was a long answer. So I'm just being really clear on if we do these things and we're looking for results, what are those results? So to say, well, we've got business below and residential above, okay, but like with the downtown, is that 100% occupied right now?
What are you referring to? The Windward?
The one you referenced, the Salt and Straw and that whole area down there.
Yeah, I can't speak to whether it's currently 100% occupied, but I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah, I think, that's at least commercial spaces are and residential.
Because that's just a curious one to me to see, if you go through all of this work and then for whatever reason, whether it's the way you were referencing the economy or something, that we've got basically empty stores and half-filled units above, and like, will they ever get filled? So it would be very interesting, just you referenced a lot of these types of designs that are in Beaverton and other places. Can you provide a list so that literally we can go look at them and see how are they doing after being, kind of finished for a period of time?
Yeah, I can certainly provide a list. I think, there's definitely more of the zones than there are projects that have been constructed in the zones, if you will. So yeah, that's certainly something that we can do a little bit more of. I tried to include at least a couple examples in Tigard that kind of, in and of themselves, really kind of get to the meat of what this is supposed to produce, which is housing, specifically housing in key areas of the city as mapped. And the number of units is, 238 is nothing to sneeze at. So.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So it'd just be helpful as a knowledge for me, just to look at it and say, see, this worked or it didn't work and why. And then the last question I had, you showed it in one of your images, across the street from each other, these new buildings visually do not look anything like each other. Is that the final design? And has anyone thought through the aesthetics for all this stuff?
They have, and it has been approved.
Okay.
That's not the purview of the Planning Commission. Yeah.
You're laughing over there, Miles. What do you?
You can adopt standards that they would have to meet in the future, but you can't.
I mean, at least look like they're somehow blended together to work as a system. I mean, you've got one very contemporary black building and then white one that looks some kind of ranch style design. And it's like, okay, I guess.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but that is not what we're here to talk about today.
I know. I'm just flagging it as
Sometimes
an
it's hard
aesthetic.
to not comment. I totally get that.
Well, where I think that might connect to what we're talking about is that, this development that we're seeing that, we're having this conversation about and that I've had similar conversations about with other people in the city are the sort of mixed-use development that would be promoted by this kind of incentive. So,
Do you
I would
have any
mention that there
experience
is
here
a
from,
hotel
Mercado
development.
Village?
I'm sorry,
Do you have
one
any
thing, really
experience?
quick.
Okay.
So that project includes a hotel, so it wouldn't be similar to a hotel. They wouldn't be able to use anything for the hotel, but it would apply to the residential and commercial part of the development. Sorry,
Did
Commissioner.
any
thank you.
of this come into play with Mercado Village at all?
It wouldn't really apply to buildings that are already constructed.
All right, but the example there is almost like what you're talking about. And I'm just wondering whether or not, if you applied this kind of overview here to that, did they get a tax exemption there? Was that?
No, they did not get tax exemptions there, but that is similar in that it is residential above non-residential ground floor, and it is more compact type of multifamily housing development that would be, fairly similar to what would be promoted through this development, although it's likely that we wouldn't be looking at as large of a site. Most likely we'd be looking at more of an urban fabric and building on existing city blocks as opposed to having a sort of large development site to begin with, like they did at Mercado Grove.
So I have a sort of a different kind of question, and this is regarding the sort of ways to incentivize the use of a program like this. In the last few years, there's been a very large demand for housing. So housing is actually, the housing side of a mixed-use development is, to me, seems sort of the easier thing to do, the easier thing to develop. What begins to get challenging, I think, for developers who want to do mixed use is to get that ground floor to work. And of course, I'm speaking from a financial standpoint. Now, we did just talk about the Windward, and it's 100% occupied, but there's a lot more visibility on that site. Some of these other sites that are, even a block or two off of sort of the main drag, so to speak, will have a little bit more of a challenging time, I think, to fill the commercial space out. And one of the large development in Tiger that you show a picture of, I think that is still, after 2-3 years, is mostly empty. So my question is, has any of these jurisdictions, or is it even possible to look at some sort of, I don't know if it's an additional incentive program, but or a complementary one that maybe helps that situation?
Yeah, I think this is one of many tools. I just want to point that out. I think in Tigard, this tax abatement was not the only thing that made these projects work. There were other financial incentives that were provided for those projects that they had to use in combination to make that actually come together financially. So, there are other things like the multiple unit limited tax exemption. There are other tax exemptions that sort of get at what you're talking about, but there are also various other ways that you can produce housing that is not specific to saying you must have a non-residential ground floor. That's kind of a unique iteration of this program, or a unique sort of part of it. So, I think that is really, the idea is to promote housing in areas where we might not necessarily want to just see housing, where you'd want more of that mix of uses. In the areas that we have downtown, in our downtown redevelopment design district, or in the EC zone in particular, which is, there's 2 zones, technically one's an overlay. But so basically we do have some form of a ground floor sort of storefront appearance requirements, and we have a number of these things already in our code. designed to produce sort of non-residential ground floors, allowing for residential on the ground floor in certain cases, but really, you know, the idea would be for this to sync up with the zoning. So in areas where that's kind of what the zoning is already aiming to produce, that these would be the appropriate areas to map something
Yeah,
like
and
this.
I'm not in any way trying to discourage ground floor commercial. It's just that, is there something that can kind of bridge the gap so
Yeah.
if that sits, you know, if that sits empty for 4 or 5 years, it's not so much of a burden?
Yeah, you know, I think that's a reasonable point to make, that, you know, this is, that sort of commercial ground floor component could present a barrier in and of itself to producing more housing. So that is kind of something to consider here. But again, it's kind of, the idea is to have more of the sort of, you know, sort of access to amenities that might be provided on those non-residential ground floors, whether they be commercial space, restaurants, retail, or you know, sort of other amenities for the building itself that might be beneficial for its residents. So it is kind of a unique beast in that way. Yeah. And I think, you know, I just point out, though, you know, there are a lot of, you know, this project has had a really hard time getting off the ground, I guess. Or, you know, it's been a long time that the city's been talking about doing this project. And we have, you know, we have a specific sort of, you know, request or sort of ask from a developer to say, this is something that would help make our project feasible and work out. So I think that in of itself is worth noting, you know, that this developer is not, you know, able to do this on their own. And, you know, I can, or I guess what, you know, the financial, I guess, landscape right out there, out there right now is quite challenging. So I think that is really something that we're wanting to respond to, and we're seeing a lot of other cities nearby take a lot more of a proactive approach to, specifically, you know, with the vertical housing development zones being mapped in a number of other adjacent cities within the region, as well as, you know, the use, more widespread use of a number of programs on top of those to facilitate this housing development. So that's just kind of where the market's at in terms of what's getting constructed around when it comes to this type of building form. The market really is, yeah, it isn't in a great place right now, and it's kind of hard to predict where it will be in the future.
Eric, a comment on that, thank you, is this concern with the commercial ground floor being leased up. I'm not sure if other cities have done this or just Gresham, but they allow 50% of that ground floor frontage to be live-work lofts.
Thanks for the input. Yeah, that is sort of one of those local criteria, I think, that were added to the program in certain areas. So, yeah, certainly fair game. But, you know, I think, you know, I think we're identifying some potential issues or potential benefits of this program, but specifically, you know, is there anything with relation to that sort of mix of commercial and residential that we should be paying attention to here? Is there, you know, I think part of the answer to your question before, Commissioner Scanoni, is that, you know, we're looking to you for a bit of guidance on what to monitor here, saying to the Planning Commission, you know, other than the things that we kind of know that we can expect to be able to look at in terms of the success of this development and the number of units and the type of commercial space. Is there anything that we should be looking at from a policy perspective in terms of how this is sort of applied to the North Anchor site that we can learn from? So, you know, I think it's an open question to you, and I don't have an answer for that. But yeah, I just wanted to clarify that it's part of what I'm looking to you for guidance on, not necessarily having all the answers myself.
Yeah, I have a question on that. Is there any way to apply some sort of preference policy to the affordable units? Because I think the idea is we want the people who are working on that ground floor commercial or nearby sites to be able to live in that housing. Is there a way that we could put a preference of people who are working in Lake Oswego and not have, you know, people living there, but then they're working still traveling far away, and then the people who are working there and would like to live in Lake Oswego still have to find housing elsewhere?
I think we'll have to look into that. Yeah, I'm not certain, but we haven't explored that yet.
Okay, I know there's a Northeast housing preference policy up in Northeast Portland.
Thanks. Yeah, that's something too for us to explore, I guess, in terms of that local preference. But yeah, I know that there's kind of anti-displacement work that's going on out there that's somewhat connected to, and it just kind of reminds me that that's another part of how we would be required to apply to map a vertical housing development zone within the city. We would have to conduct an analysis of potential displacement risk. So just another step that I did not outline earlier, but that is just kind of got me thinking of that.
And when you're saying displacement, you're talking specifically about other existing residential, right?
Yes, I'm not sure that it's specific to residential. It could be commercial, theoretically. So that's, something that, we would need to, once we had sort of an idea of where we wanted to look for a larger zone, or, obviously with the pilot program, it would be just 3 parcels. But the idea is that, there's, anyway, I think for the most part, I lost my train of thought there. I apologize. But yeah. Did I answer your question? I trailed off there.
It did, yeah. I mean, my question was basically, is that apply only to residential, or is there?
Yeah, right. Sorry. So commercial displacement is certainly a thing. It's a little bit harder to define. It's hard to sort of track this stuff in general when it comes to displacement. But that's something we haven't really begun to explore too much yet, but it is a requirement for us to apply. We would have to do that.
Does this invite us to incorporate what we've already gone through here as far as parking? In other words, is this another issue here that has to be contended with here as far as the building of something like this?
I think we have, again, we have this sort of pilot project on specific sites, and that's an opportunity in and of itself, but we don't have a requirement to do this from the state. Again, we have a requirement to look at the development of a housing production strategy. So that's a larger sort of strategy with smaller individual strategies within it. And this is one of, dozens of different strategies, if not more, that we will be asked to analyze for our work on that housing production strategy. So it's not a case where this is being shoved down our throats, but it's one of the many options, and one that seems to have at least a little bit of traction on one site in the city so far. But it's not being forced on the city to make a decision one way or the other on. I guess we're not being forced to adopt a housing or a vertical housing development zone by the state specifically.
This seems like one approach, though, to relieve the pressure on the neighborhoods, though, by looking for incentives to build housing in the city center.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to make, that there are appropriate places to make this, and that a lot of times when more housing is provided in areas that are deemed appropriate, it can take pressure off of other areas of the city. So yeah, I think a lot of folks have really responded negatively to the idea of more infill in single-family neighborhoods. So this might be something that they would prefer.
I think if your question is, since we can impose additional criteria, can we require a development to provide parking even though it may not be required by state law or city code? And that's something we might want to look into.
I think it's, yeah, I don't think that this supersedes parking regulations at all.
But can it be an additional standard?
It can be an additional standard, but it can't conflict with the state criteria and minimum eligibility, so, yeah.
If that was your question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's designed to work sort of in concert with the climate-friendly and equitable communities work, in that they're both ways to encourage housing and housing to be developed more affordably, but they don't really preclude one another. You can't do one instead of the other necessarily in this case.
Do you have any information on what the estimated cost on these units are going to be, the residential side?
I don't know, Sid, do you have an up-to-date estimate of that by any chance? So this is Sidero Sin, our redevelopment, city redevelopment manager.
Yeah, thanks. So the market rate units range from studio to up to 3 bedrooms, and I think they're between anywhere between 1,500 to 2,500.
But the pricing is not part of the DDA?
Pricing is not part of the DDA, and these are market rate rental units, so they're not
Right, so
for
it's
sale
based upon
units.
our information at this time of what the market is. That's, I mean,
Right, and they should be very comparable to other downtown multifamily units.
You know, there are 8 subsidized units, I guess, that would be required to be available at 80% of area median income, right? But that's,
Yeah, what was the question about the market rate ones or the workforce housing?
I was just curious
sorry.
what the actual housing, costs were going to, what was the price range for this? In terms of someone wanting to rent or purchase,
I
what's
mean, I don't
that
think
fee
we can
look like?
speak to that. I mean,
Right, we can't, and the only reason I'm throwing out that number is we did a joint, we were at the farmer's market this weekend, and we were talking about the project with UDP, and they were throwing out a number between 1,500 to maybe 2,500 for some of the units.
and that's not to say that affordability levels are unrelated to this program. You know, there are, again, incentives at least that are a part of this to produce affordable housing units. So you can get that additional tax abatement on the value of the land. If you provide, a certain percentage of affordable housing units, you can get, that percentage of the sort of value of the land exempted as well. So that is, in and of itself, built into the program an incentive to produce more affordable units. So, I think if there's generally like a concern or direction saying that we should try to target more affordable units with this, there are other ways that we can, again, look at the local criteria and ways to build in more affordability requirements, potentially, if we were to map this more broadly, so that, these tax abatements would really, or it would probably be more like incentives. I'm not sure that we could make them requirements per se. We can look into that, but there are ways to target and incentivize more affordable units if that is your concern.
So I think I heard you right. So are you saying there's a direct correlation between percentage of affordable units and percentage of sort of site cost abatement?
Yeah, I think it's, again, the assessed value of the land and how much tax abatement you can have of that. I think it's like, and this is really diving into the details here a little bit, but, my understanding is that the floor area of affordable housing units as a percentage of the total floor area is kind of how you get the percentage of the land.
And that's, that we don't have to get into the details. I was just making sure I understood what you were saying.
Yeah, so that's kind of built into the program that there is an incentive for affordable units, but there are additional local criteria that have been adopted in various other locations, such as Beaverton, where they're really trying to work hard to promote affordable housing to be specifically developed. So a lot of incentive programs and even a connection to, like, I think a fund for sort of making sort of these projects work and, providing that extra money. So it's pretty robust. So anyway, that's sort of the landscape of options. Is we could take a very aggressive approach with this towards affordability if that was the sort of direction that we ended up wanting to go.
Any other comments from the commission or questions? I think it's a pretty good discussion. I hope it helps, and I hope we didn't get into the weeds too much.
Oh, I fully expect getting into the weeds with folks here, and it's hard to
Sometimes
talk
it
about
can't
this
be
without,
helped.
yeah. I mean, it does kind of beg a lot of questions. So, as always, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions after the meeting.
So one final question that I have, has staff thought about, if this is a successful venture with this particular site, have you thought about whether you would pursue this as more of a zone type thing or versus sort of a site-by-site?
Yeah, we certainly, I think if we were to apply it to a larger geography than the North Anchor site, we would look, at areas that are within the town centers, most likely Lake Grove and Downtown Redevelopment Design Center downtown. But, we have the opportunity to have more of that discussion. So there might be certain areas that make sense, certain areas that don't. We could target sites if we know of some ones that are likely to develop. This North Anchor property is probably the best candidate for something we know is likely to develop with housing in the near term, or that we can at least play a role in, at least as well with the development of housing. But yeah, there's discussion that we would certainly have about that. I'm not going to necessarily get in advance of the housing production strategy recommendations, but again, there's some traction here, so we did want to give this a little bit more of an airing for that process, the housing production strategy work. And so, I don't want to say we definitely will do that, but we have committed to explore it at least. So we'll probably talk about it a little bit more than other strategies at least, and then take direction from there.
Good.
One last question. For our next meeting, when we discuss this, what additional information will you have available to discuss and review?
So we won't be discussing the pilot program again at the Planning Commission, but we will be discussing this within the context of the housing production strategy work. So we'll have ample information for you all to look at, and it'll be a little bit more within the context of all of the other strategies out there that we could be using, and saying, what are the pros, what are the cons of this in terms of that much larger landscape of what we could be doing.
Okay.
But yeah, in terms of the process, we will be taking this to the LoRa board for more discussion, and then it would go to council for a hearing on this. And they would basically approve this through the adoption of an ordinance at city council, and that's scheduled for December currently. So that's kind of the next steps for this project, not at the Planning Commission, but at city council.
Okay, thank you. I did say at the beginning of this update that public comment would be accepted. Do we have anyone on the phone? Okay, I just want to make sure before we move on. All right, other business. Eric, do we have any other, or are we ready for schedule review?
Well, I think just to sort of really cross our T's and dot all of our I's, I think we might have a volunteer to be the Neighborhood Coalition of Lake Oswego representative from the Planning Commission.
Nice.
We are meeting tomorrow, but it would be great if you could make some type of vote or something on this to appoint Commissioner Twing has volunteered to be the person in that role. So if you all just want to consider that, I guess, formally at this meeting to make it official, that would be welcome.
Sounds good. Well, I move to approve, unless you object.
No.
Okay, just want to make sure. Do I have a second?
Second the motion.
All right. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, motion carries. Thank you for volunteering. Well, good. We got it done at the 11th hour.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it definitely helps to have that formal action here at the commission. But yeah, I can get into schedule review if you'd like.
Yes, please do.
All right, so coming up at our next meeting, as I mentioned, we'll have a hearing on the housing needs analysis update for 2023. So that's something that we distributed the materials for a while back, back on the 24th of July. So they've been out there for a while, but the formal hearing will be in 2 weeks on the 28th of August. And so basically public comment will begin to be accepted 10 days prior to that meeting date. Coming up, the meeting after that, we'll be considering adoption of findings. If we do end up making a recommendation at the hearing on the 28th, on the 11th of September, we would be considering the findings. Really quick note that will be a remote meeting, so we'll just be meeting remotely that day. We tend to do that in instances where we have a fairly limited agenda, and specifically with the adoption of findings, that's a good opportunity to not have a full-on meeting. And then the next sort of check-in will be on September 25th. We'll have a work session, our second work session on the parking rules of the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules that were passed by the state. So we'll have sort of the second round of information for you all on that. And that takes us out at least a month and a half here. So.
Good. All right. Looking forward to it. All right. I think that's it for tonight. With that, we are adjourned.
You know, that point that you raised in the very beginning here,